Welcome back to the Cine Flux. If you are here, you already know what this channel is about. Not summaries, not scorecards. Something closer to sitting with a film in a quiet room and asking it what it actually meant. And today, the film we are sitting with is one that I found myself returning to in a way I did not fully expect. It is a film about stillness and devastation. About a man who has chosen peace and carries war in every breast. About the south of Italy and the sun and the sea and the blood. Today we are talking about the Equalizer tree. So make yourself comfortable. Let the world outside go quiet for a little while. This is the Cine Flux, and this is for you. There is a particular quality of silence that only certain films understand. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of fate, the kind that sits in a room after something irreversible has happened, the kind that wraps itself around a man who has done terrible things and chosen, at great cost, to stop. The equalizer tree opens inside that silence. Before the first word is spoken, before the story declares its intentions, there is a man and a body and the golden light of the Italian countryside, and something in the air between them that tells you, without explanation, without narration, that this is not simply an action film. It is a film about what a man carries when he walks away from violence, and whether walking away is ever truly possible. That is the question this film lives inside, and it is a question worth following all the way to the end. The Equalizer 3 was released in 2023. It is the third film in the Equalizer franchise, directed by Antoine Fuqua, written by Richard Wenk, and starring Denzel Washington in what is likely the final chapter of his portrayal of Robert McCall, a man of quiet menace, extraordinary capability, and genuine moral hunger. The film co-stars Dakota Fanning as a CIA analyst named Emma Collins and Eugenio Mastrandrea as Marco Coranta, a local police officer in the small Sicilian coastal town of Altamonte. It is an action thriller in genre, but something closer to a meditation in spirit. The world it inhabits is sun-drenched and ancient. Cobblestone streets, fishing boats, espresso in the morning, the Tyrrhenian sea stretching to the horizon, and against this backdrop, Robert McCall arrives broken, bleeding, and searching for something he cannot name. What he finds is a rest. What follows that rest is, as always with McCall, inevitable. Here is the thing about sitting down with this film for the first time. I came in carrying the memory of the first two Equalizer films, both of which I admire for different reasons, and I expected this third chapter to follow a familiar shape. I expected escalation. I expected a bigger threat, a louder action set piece, a more elaborate villain. What I did not expect was the pace at which this film refuses to rush. When I first sat with this film, I settled in for a certain kind of light, and what I got instead was something quieter and more melancholy than I had anticipated. The opening sequence is genuinely arresting, not for its action, though there is action, but for the mood it establishes. There is a winery, there are bodies. There is Denzel Washington moving through a space as though gravity itself defers to him. And then there is a wound and a collapse and a long slow recovery, and suddenly you understand that this film has a different intention than its predecessors. It intends to close something. It intends to ask what Robert McCall wants now after everything. And that question, deceptively simple, genuinely profound, is what kept me present for every quiet minute that followed. The story as an experience begins in the aftermath of violence rather than its anticipation. Robert McCall is found barely alive on the steps of a small church in the town of Altamonte by a local doctor and a police officer named Marco, and what follows is weeks of recovery, quiet meals, slow walks, the growing warmth of a community that takes him in without asking too much about where he came from. And this is where the film does something that surprised me. It lingers. It allows Robert McCall to simply exist in beauty for a while. He drinks wine with the old men in the piazza. He learns names. He watches the light change over the water. For a significant stretch of the film's first half, The Equalizer 3 is almost not an action film at all. It is something closer to a traveler's reverie, a portrait of a wounded man discovering, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, what peace actually feels like in the body rather than just the mind. This is a deliberate artistic choice, and it is one that I think divides audiences in a way that reveals something about what they came looking for. If you arrive at this film wanting the equalizer to equalize from the opening reel, the first hour may test your patience. But if you arrive willing to follow a character into stillness, what Fuqua and Washington construct in that first half is genuinely moving. There is a scene early, small, seemingly inconsequential, where McCall sits at a cafe table and watches the town square fill with morning life, and the expression on Washington's face is not calculation or tactical awareness. It is something close to wonder. This is a man who has spent decades being the most dangerous person in any room he enters, watching ordinary joy as though it is a foreign language he is only now beginning to understand. The threat arrives gradually, as all threats do in films wise enough not to announce themselves too early. A local organized crime operation, the Camorra, the Neapolitan mob, has its hooks in Altamonte. The people McCall has come to care about are being squeezed, threatened, shaken down. And there is a larger story running parallel, one involving the CIA and a network of drug trafficking with international implications, which is where Emma Collins enters, assigned to trace a conspiracy whose threats eventually lead to the same small town where McCall has chosen to rest. The two storylines weave toward each other with patience, and the film holds them in careful balance until the moment when they must converge. And here is where the film shifts completely, where the man who found peace must decide, one more time, what he is willing to become in order to protect the people he has learned to love. And so let us begin there, with what this film actually achieves. Because that is the question that matters most once the story has been told. Not what happened, but how it was done, and why the doing of it stays with you. Because The Equalizer 3 is a film of extraordinary surfaces and occasionally profound interiors, and understanding what it achieves requires that we look at every layer: the performances, the writing, the visual glamour, the sound design, the music, and ask not simply whether each element worked, but what each element was reaching for, and how close it came to touching what it intended. Let us begin with Denzel Washington, because there is genuinely no other place to begin. He is the reason this franchise exists, and more importantly, he is the reason it means anything at all. Robert McCall, as written, is not a complicated character on the page. He is a skilled operator with a moral code, a quiet manner, and the capacity for extraordinary violence. That description could belong to dozens of action heroes across cinema history. What Denzel Washington does with that blueprint is something else entirely. He brings interiority to a character who is largely defined by withholding. He makes the silences speak. He makes the stillness feel inhabited rather than empty. And in this third film, in what may genuinely be his farewell to this role, Washington does something that I keep returning to even weeks after watching. He allows Robert McCall to be tired, not weak, not diminished, not broken in the ways that action films so often mistake for depth, the haunted backstory deployed as shorthand for complexity, the tragic past wheeled out to justify the present violence. Washington's fate in this film is something quieter and more honest than that. It is the tiredness of a man who has been extraordinary for so long that he no longer remembers what ordinary felt like, and who has finally, in this small Italian coastal town, been given a glimpse of it. There is a physical quality to Washington's performance here that I do not think gets discussed enough. The way he moves in the early recovery sequences, carefully, deliberately, with a kind of conscious attention to each step, communicates volumes about a body that has been pushed past its limits and is learning, perhaps for the first time, to ask permission of itself before it acts. And then, when the violence returns, when McCall reassembles himself into the instrument he was trained to be, the contrast is devastating. Because you have spent an hour watching him try not to be that, and now here he is again, and the ease with which it all comes back tells you everything about what he has really been carrying all this time. The scene I keep returning to, the single scene that proves the full range of what Washington is doing in this film, is not an action sequence. It is a dinner. A long, slow dinner in the home of one of the local families McCall has befriended, where the table is crowded and the wine is flowing and the conversation is warm and slightly chaotic in the way of Italian family meals, and McCall sits at the edge of it all and watches, just watches. He does not perform enjoyment, he does not demonstrate warmth through dialogue. He simply observes, and the expression on his face moves through something so layered and so private that you feel, watching it, that you are intruding on something real. There is gratitude in it. There is grief in it. There is a particular sadness of a man who understands that he has arrived at beauty too late to fully belong to it, and who is choosing to receive it anyway, to let it land, even knowing it cannot stay. Washington does all of this without a single line of dialogue. That is not acting in the conventional sense, that is something closer to being. The transformation McCall undergoes in this film, and it is a transformation, though a subtle one, costs him something specific, and that cost is what the film is really about. The version of McCall we meet in the opening sequence is a man operating in the world he knows, competent, cold, purposeful. The version we meet in Ultimate is a man trying to locate something human in himself that the years of his previous life have all but buried, and the version we are left with at the film's close is something that holds both of those men in tension, not resolved, not simple but honest. He has not been redeemed in the way that Hollywood usually means when it uses that word. He has been witnessed, and Washington makes you feel the difference between those two things. Moving now to the film's screenplay, because Richard Van's writing deserves more careful attention than it typically receives, particularly in discussions of this franchise. The Equalizer films are often categorized as straight-ahead action vehicles, and that categorization, while not entirely wrong, tends to flatten what is actually happening on the page. Wink understands something crucial about Robert McCall that makes these scripts work even when they are not doing anything particularly surprising at the plot level. He understands that McCall is not primarily defined by what he does, but by why he does it, and more importantly, by the elaborate moral architecture that surrounds the doing. The screenplay for The Equalizer 3 leans into this more fully than either of the previous installments. What makes this screenplay more than functional is the way it uses restraint as a structural principle. Other action films fill silence with exposition. Van's script for this film trusts silence to carry meaning. There are exchanges between McCall and Marco, the young police officer, that consist of very few words, but establish an entire emotional relationship between two men from completely different worlds who recognize something in each other. A shared decency, a shared understanding of what it means to care about people you cannot fully protect. The dialogue in these scenes is bare to the point of poetry. It does not explain the connection. It simply makes space for the connection to exist and allows the actors to inhabit that space. That is a writing choice, not an accident, and it is the right choice. There is also a quiet intelligence in the way the screenplay handles the Camorra storyline, the local organized crime network that serves as the film's primary threat. Wang does not make these men cartoonish. He does not give them elaborate villain speeches or theatrical cruelty for its own sake. He makes them something more unsettling. Ordinary men doing terrible things for the most ordinary of reasons: money, territory, habit. The banality of their evil is, in its way, more disturbing than a more flamboyant villainy would be, because it points towards something true about how violence actually operates in the world, not always in the hands of exceptional monsters, but often in the hands of people who simply stopped asking whether what doing was right. Against that kind of evil, McCall's particular moral precision, his insistence on deserved consequence, his refusal of collateral damage, carries a different weight than it would against a more theatrical villain. It feels in some strange way principled. The scene in the screenplay that I find most intelligent, the one that reveals the film's genuine emotional intelligence most clearly, is a conversation between McCall and the doctor who first treated him, an older man who asks no questions about the nature of McCall's wounds and makes no judgments about what he clearly suspects about his patient's history. The scene is brief. It consists mostly of pleasantries and the quiet business of a medical consultation. but underneath it is an entire unspoken understanding between two men about the nature of discretion, about what it means to help someone without needing to know their whole story, about the particular grace that is extended when someone decides to trust rather than interrogate. It is a small scene, it earns something large. That is what good writing does. Now to the visual language, because Antoine Fuqua's direction of this film is something I want to spend real time with, because it is both the film's greatest artistic achievement and, in certain moments, a window into the film's limitations. But we will get to those limitations in a moment. First, the achievements. Fuqua has always been a visually capable director. But what he does in The Equalizer 3 feels like an evolution. A director who has spent three films finding the visual grammar of this character, and who arrives here with something close to mastery over the particular combination of stillness and eruption that defines Robert McCall's world. The key to understanding Foucault's visual approach in this film is the contrast he establishes between two entirely different cinematic registers and the care with which he moves between them. The first register is entirely almost classical. The footage of Altamonte, the actual coastal village of Altamora and the surrounding Amalfi Coast region, where much of the film was shot, is captured with a warmth and a grandeur that is almost operatic. Cinematographer Rod Dixon, who has shot films for Scorsese, Tarantino, and Oliver Stone among others, brings to the Italian sequences a quality of golden light that feels simultaneously real and mythologized. This is not merely travelogue photography, though the locations are extraordinary enough that lesser filmmakers might have stopped there. Richardson and Fuqua used the landscape as emotional information. The wide vistas of sea and sky communicate the particular solitude of a man standing at the edge of what might be his final chapter. The narrow cobblestone streets, short, tight, and intimate, communicate the closeness of community, the way a small town wraps around its people, whether they wanted to or not. The light itself, that distinctive southern Italian gold, is used almost as a character, warming the frames in which McCall is at peace, becoming harsher, more clinical, more industrial in the sequences where violence intrudes. The second register is something else entirely, and the transition between the two is the visual achievement I find most striking in this film. When Foucault shifts into the action sequences, the camera loses its classical composure. It becomes immediate, close, almost uncomfortably intimate in a way that strips the violence of any glamour and renders it instead in something closer to its actual texture. Fast, brutal, slightly chaotic, and deeply consequential. There are action films that make violence beautiful. Fuqua in this film makes a conscious choice to make it neither beautiful nor ugly but simply real, which is in its own way the most disturbing option of the three. There are three shots in this film that I find genuinely extraordinary, and I want to describe each of them because images like these are why cinema matters and why talking about them matters. The first is a shot that occurs early in the film during McCall's initial arrival in Altamonte. He is being carried half conscious toward shelter, and the camera holds on his face, not the faces of the people helping him, not the landscape he is passing through, but his face, and the quality of his expression in that moment is unlike anything I have seen from Washington in this franchise. There is vulnerability in it that is almost shocking after two films of absolute control. The man who can calculate the incapacitation of a room full of threats in a matter of seconds is, in this moment, simply a body that needs to be carried. The shot holds that truth without comment. It simply looks at him and allows you to see what is underneath the capability. The second shot is from the dinner scene I mentioned earlier, a moment where Fuqua pulls the camera very slowly back from a close-up of McCaw's face to a wider frame that gradually reveals the entire family table surrounding him, all of them animated and alive and talking over each other, with the comfortable noise of people who have eaten together 1,000 times, and McCall at the edge of it all, watching whatever 1,000 times, and McCall at the edge of it all. The slow pull reveals the context of his watching, and the context changes what the watching means. Alone, his expression is moving. In the wider frame, it becomes something heartbreaking. He is surrounded by exactly what he wanted, and he cannot fully enter it. The camera understands this before the character can see it. That is direction at the highest level. The third shot is from the film's climatic sequence, and I will speak to it here without spoiling the specific action, only the visual grammar of it. There is a moment where McCall stands in a space that has just been the site of significant violence, and the camera frames him in a doorway, backlit by the late afternoon sun, so that he exists simultaneously as a dark silhouette against the golden light, and as a man caught between two worlds, the world of what he just did and the world of what he is trying to return to. The image holds for longer than you might expect. It does not cut away quickly. It lets you sit with the duality of this man, with the terrible beauty of what he is, and it does not offer you a simple feeling about any of it. You are allowed to find it both right and wrong at the same time. That complexity, delivered in a single image, is what cinema can do that no other art form can do in quite the same way. Let us talk now about the score and the sound design, because music in the Equalizer films has always been a crucial element of how the franchise communicates its emotional intentions, and the third film is no exception, though what it does with sound is, in some ways, the most interesting of the three. The score for The Equalizer 3 is composed by Marcelo Zarvos, who takes a different approach from the music of the earlier films and leans much more heavily into the sonic textures of the Mediterranean world McCall has entered. There are passages in this score, particularly in the quieter sections of the first half, that draw on classical Italian instrumentation, on folk melodies and acoustic resonances that feel indigenous to the landscapes being shown. This is not decoration. It is integration. The music arguing that McCall's piece in Altamonte is not a temporary pause but a genuine arrival, and that the world he has arrived in has its own deep musical identity that is worth taking seriously. What the score does when it enters is tell you something about what McCall is feeling that he cannot or will not say. In the recovery sequences, the music is spare and warm, strings and acoustic guitar, and the kind of patient, unhurried melody that communicates comfort without sentimentality. In the action sequences, the score withdraws almost entirely, replaced by sound design, footsteps, breathing, the specific sounds of a confrontation, which is itself a compositional choice, a way of saying that when McCall operates, there is no romance in it, no elevated emotional register, only consequence. And in the film's quieter dramatic moments, the dinner, the conversations with Marco, the long walks through the town, the music enters softly, underneath the dialogue rather than over it, so subtly at times that you are not sure whether you are hearing a score or simply the ambient sound of the town itself, arranged into something almost melodic. That ambiguity is beautiful. It says that peace and music are perhaps the same thing. The use of silence as sound in this film is equally sophisticated. There are stretches in the first half where Fuqua and his sound team strip the audio down to almost nothing, just the distant sound of the sea, a bird, the clink of a coffee cup, and the effect of that stripping is not emptiness but presence. You become acutely aware of the physical world Mokol is inhabiting. You hear what he hears. You feel the quiet that he is trying to absorb into himself. And because you have been given that quiet so generously in the first half, the intrusion of violence into it in the second half lands differently than it would in a film that had never offered silence at all. The contrast is the point, the silence is the argument for everything that follows. Craft and construction, the technical layer of this film, deserve acknowledgement not as a separate category but as a fundamental expression of its thematic intentions. Every technical choice in The Equalizer 3 is at its best a choice made in service of the film's central question. What does it cost a man to be what Robert McCall is, and what does it mean that he keeps choosing to pay that cost? The editing by Conrad Buff and Michael Tronick maintains the deliberate rhythm of Fuqua's direction, never rushing past a quiet moment because it is quiet, never letting the film mistake pace for meaning. The production design, particularly in the recreation of Old Tamontes town square and the interiors of the buildings McCall comes to inhabit, creates a world that feels lived in and specific, with the texture of real human habitation rather than a set built to approximate it. The costume design makes a choice that I find quietly significant. McCall wears simple clothes throughout most of this film, civilian clothes, in colors that blend with the Italian landscape, as if he is trying to become invisible in the best possible way, to disappear into ordinariness rather than into shadow. And it almost works. That almost is the entire film. So let us now turn, with the same care and the same honesty, to where this film falls short. Because the Equalizer 3, for all that it achieves, is not without real weaknesses, and identifying them is not a betrayal of its genuine strengths, but a way of understanding what kept a very good film from being a great one. The first and most significant weakness is the CIS subplot, and specifically the character of Emma Collins as she is written. Dakota Fanning is a gifted actress and she brings genuine commitment to this role, but the material she is given is, by the standards of the rest of the film, disappointingly conventional. Emma Collins exists largely as a structural mechanism. She is the character through whom the audience receives the necessary information about the Camorra network and the larger drug trafficking conspiracy, and that function is largely all she is asked to be. Her backstory is sketched rather than drawn. Her relationship with McCall, when they finally share the screen, has warmth in the performance but thin support from the script. There is a version of this character, a CI analyst navigating a world of institutionalism, trying to do the right thing in an organization that has decided pragmatism is the same as ethics, that could have been genuinely compelling. The film gestures at that version of Emma Collins without fully committing to it. And that incompleteness matters because the film is asking us to care about what she uncovers, and it is harder to care fully when the person doing the uncovering remains somewhat opaque. The second weakness is a pacing problem in the film's second act transition, the period where the Camorra threat begins to assert itself but before the full confrontation is set in motion. The film has established its peaceful register so thoroughly and so lovingly in the first half that the gear shift into thriller territory feels, in places, slightly awkward. There are scenes in this stretch that are neither fully the contemplative film the first half promised, nor fully the action film the third act will deliver. They exist in an uncertain tonal middle ground where the film seems to be negotiating with itself about what it wants to be. This is not a fatal flaw, the film finds its footing again before long. But there is a period of perhaps 15 to 20 minutes where the scenes are visible in a way they are not elsewhere, and a tighter structural approach in this section might have made the overall experience more coherent. The third weakness is the Camorra villains themselves, and here I want to be careful because I praise Wink's writing for its restraint with these characters, and that praise was genuine. But there is a version of restraint that borders on underwriting, and in the case of the primary antagonist, the film occasionally crosses that border. The organized crime figures McCall eventually confronts are believable and unromanticized, which is to the film's credit, but they are also at times so underdeveloped that the confrontation with them lacks the emotional or dramatic weight that the best action films achieve when their conflict feels genuinely personal. The Equalizer as a franchise has always been better when the villain had a specific face and a specific menace. Robert Woodall in the first film, the Russian mob in the second, the more diffuse organizational threat in the third film produces confrontations that are technically impressive but occasionally emotionally cool because the film has not given us a villain we have learned to fear in the specific way that great antagonists require. There is also a sense in the film's largest action sequences that the franchise's familiar iconography is being honored more than evolved. McCall's method of pre-visualizing and executing the incapacitation of multiple threats, the slow-motion mental calculation followed by the rapid real-time execution, is one of the Equalizer franchise's signature formal gestures, and it is deployed here with craft and efficiency. But it is also a gesture we have seen twice before, and in this third film, the choice to return to it rather than to find a new way to show how McCall operates feels more like comfort than invention. It works, But by this point in the franchise, I find myself wishing it would surprise me. These weaknesses are not wounds, they are texture. They are the places where a very ambitious film did not quite reach what it was stretching toward, and acknowledging them is simply being honest about the gap between what this film is and what, in its best moments, it seemed capable of being. None of them undo what the film achieves, they simply define the edges of it. Now let us step back from the film itself for a moment and talk about how it came to exist. Because the behind the scenes story of the Equalizer 3 is genuinely fascinating, and understanding how a film was made always reshapes how you see specific moments within it. The Equalizer franchise began with the 2014 film directed by Fuqua and starring Washington, which was itself an adaptation of the 1985 television series of the same name. The series starred Edward Woodward as a retired intelligence operative who used his skills to help ordinary people in trouble, a premise of elegant simplicity and essentially inexhaustible moral appeal. Washington and Fuqua had worked together previously on Training Day in 2001, the film for which Washington won his second Academy Award, and their creative partnership on The Equalizer was, from the beginning, one built on mutual respect and shared instinct about what kind of film they wanted to make. The first film was a genuine surprise, a studio action film with the patience and the interiority of an art film, carrying a moral seriousness that most of its genre companions had abandoned entirely. The second film, released in 2018, was Washington's first ever sequel, a fact that is both striking and revealing about how he approached his career. In 4 decades of major film roles, Robert McCall was the first character Washington had judged towards return to, which tells you something important about what this character meant to him personally. In an interview from around the time of the second film's release, Washington spoke about McCall as a character he had not finished with, a man whose interiority he had not fully explored. The second film had its admirers and its detractors, but what it established was a willingness to take McCall outside the familiar urban environments of the first film and to test what the character was made of in different worlds. That willingness would be fully realized in the third. The decision to set the Equalizer 3 in southern Italy was not, as it might appear, an aesthetic indulgence. It was a narrative and thematic argument. Fuqua spoke publicly during the film's production about his desire to find a setting that would serve as a genuine contrast to McCall's history. Not simply a new location for the same story, but a place whose culture, pace, and human warmth could credibly represent something McCall had never had and was not sure he deserved. The Amalfi Coast, and specifically the town of Altamora in Basilicata, standing in for the fictional Altamonte, offered not just extraordinary visual beauty, but a particular quality of life, a community cohesion, a way of existing together in public space that could function as the film's moral ideal. McCall does not simply fight for these people because they are in danger. He fights for them because they showed him what he was fighting against losing in himself in the world. It is a fascinating detail about the production that reshapes one specific aspect of how you watch the film. Denzel Washington, who was in his late 60s during the making of this film, insisted on performing a significant portion of his own action choreography, not the most dangerous elements, which were handled by his stunt team, but the foundational movement, the physical logic of how Michael occupies space and transitions from stillness to violence. The deliberateness of McCall's movement in the action sequences, that particular economy, the sense of a man who does nothing with his body that he has not fully decided to do, is partly a performance choice and partly a physical reality of an actor who has genuinely internalized the character's relationship to his own body over 3 films. When you watch McCall move through a confrontation in this film, you are watching the product of years of collaboration between Washington and his stunt coordinators, but you are also watching a genuine physical performance from an actor who refused to simply hand the character's body over to a double. That commitment shows. It is one of the reasons the action sequences in this film feel inhabited rather than illustrated. Another detail worth knowing is that wine harvest sequence in the film's opening, the sequence that establishes the film's visual language and introduces us to the aftermath of violence in that golden landscape, was not originally intended to open the film. In early cuts, the opening was more conventional, closer in structure to the openings of the first two Equalizer films, beginning with McCall already engaged in his work. The decision to lead instead with the quiet devastation of that harvest setting, to begin the film in aftermath rather than action, was a late editorial choice that fundamentally changed the experience of watching it. Beginning in aftermath rather than action forces you immediately into a different register. It tells you, before the story has said a single word, that this film is interested in what comes after, not merely in the event itself. That choice is, I think, one of the best structural decisions the film makes. It is also worth knowing that the relationship between McCall and Marco, the young police officer played by Eugenio Mastrandrea, was significantly expanded during production from what appeared in the original script. Mastrandrea's chemistry with Washington in early shooting prompted Fuqua to develop their scenes together more fully, to give the mentorship between the two men more time and more texture. The result is one of the film's genuine emotional cores, a relationship that carries the story's thematic argument about legacy and transmission, about what a man like McCall can pass on and what he must withhold. Mastrandra's performance in these scenes is one of the film's quiet pleasures, a young actor holding his own opposite Washington with a warmth and a naturalism that never feels like performance. There is also a remarkable fact about the film's sound design that changes how you hear the action sequences once you know it. The specific acoustic signature of the Altamonte setting, the echo of the cobblestone streets, the particular resonance of the stone buildings, the way sound moves differently in that enclosed Mediterranean geography, was recorded on location and used as the basis for the action sequence sound design, so that even in the most intense confrontational moments, the sonic world of the town persists underneath the action. The sound you hear during the climactic sequences is not a generic action soundscape dropped over Italian scenery. It is the actual acoustic character of that specific place, shaped and heightened but fundamentally real. That means that the violence in this film sounds like it belongs to the town, which is thematically exactly right. This is not violence imported from outside. It is the violence that was always there, in the words of that beautiful place, and McCall is simply the force that brings it to the surface. One final production detail that I find genuinely moving: the Equalizer tree was announced by Washington and Fuqua as the final chapter of the McCall story, not with the hedge of "we're leaving the door open," but with the conviction of filmmakers who knew they were finishing something. Washington spoke about it as a conclusion that he had been working toward since the first film, a sense of where McCall needed to arrive, not as a plot destination but as an emotional one, setting tension. The knowledge that this was a goodbye being crafted with care is present in every quiet moment of the film. It changes how you receive the slower passages, the long gazes, the conversations that do not rush. You are watching a filmmaker and an actor who know they are in their last chapter with this character, and who have decided to spend that chapter in beauty and meaning rather than spectacle. That is a choice that costs something commercially and gains something artistically, and it is the kind of choice that defines whether a filmmaker is genuinely in service of the story or merely in service of the franchise. And so, having understood how this film was built, the choices that shaped it, the commitments that defined it, the details that only reveal themselves when you know where to look, we now turn to the world that received it. Because a film does not exist in a vacuum, it arrives into a specific cultural moment, into a marketplace with specific expectations, into a conversation already in progress. And how the world responds to a film tells you something, not only about the film, but about the world that is doing the responding. The Equalizer 3 arrived in September of 2023, and what happened next is worth understanding carefully. The film opened to approximately $42 million in North America in its opening weekend, a number that, by the standards of the modern blockbuster era, might appear modest, but which tells a more nuanced story when you understand the context surrounding it. every day. The Beat Channel has never been a franchise in the Marvel or Fast and Furious sense. It does not come with a pre-sold universe, a decade of interconnected mythology, or a built-in international audience primed by years of expanded world building. What it has and has always had is a specific and intensely loyal audience, primarily adult viewers, primarily over the age of 25, primarily drawn to character driven action with genuine moral weight rather than spectacle for its own sake. This audience does not arrive in the explosive opening weekend surges that define franchise films aimed at younger demographics. They arrive steadily, consistently across multiple weeks in the way that word of mouth rather than marketing saturation has always driven. And the Equalizer 3 performed in exactly that pattern, holding strongly in its second and third weekends in a way that suggested genuine audience satisfaction rather than curiosity driven first weekend attendance. The film's international performance was equally instructive and in some ways more revealing. In European markets, particularly in France, Italy, and Germany, the Equalizer 3 outperformed both of its predecessors by a significant margin. This is not, I think, coincidental. The film's setting in southern Italy, its engagement with European landscapes and European social realities, its willingness to treat the Mediterranean world not as an exotic backdrop but as a subject with its own dignity and complexity. All of this resonated with European audiences in a way that a more generically American action film would not have. There is something in the film's implicit argument that a certain quality of life, a certain way of being in community is worth fighting for, that played differently in countries where that quality of life is not an abstract ideal but a living cultural inheritance. The Equalizer 3 made approximately $90 million worldwide in its theatrical run, against a production budget of approximately $70 million, which, when theatrical distribution costs are factored in, represents a modest but genuine theatrical success. What is perhaps more interesting than the theatrical numbers is the film's streaming life, which has been, by most available measures, extraordinary. Released on Netflix in certain international territories and on Amazon Prime Video in others, The Equalizer 3 has continued to accumulate viewership in the months and years following its theatrical release in a way that suggests it has found and is continuing to find the audience it was made for. This is a pattern that tells us something important about how certain kinds of films now exist in the culture, not as events that burn brightly for a weekend and then fade from conversation, but as discoveries, films that people find in the quiet of an ordinary evening and then recommend with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has found something they did not know they needed. The Equalizer franchise in general, and the third film in particular, has become one of the defining examples of what might be called the streaming slow burn, a film that does not need a massive opening weekend to matter, because it has built a relationship with its audience that is deeper and more durable than event film excitement. The critical response to The Equalizer 3 was, in a word, divided, though that division reveals something interesting when you look at it closely. Professional critics, as a general body, responded to the film with a kind of respectful ambivalence. The consensus acknowledged Washington's performance as outstanding, acknowledged the Italian photography as visually distinguished, and acknowledged the film's general craft and seriousness of intention. What divided opinion was the pacing, specifically the question of whether the film's extended investment in the contemplative first half was a meaningful artistic choice or a test of patience that the film's eventual action payoff did not fully justify. Critics who came to the film as action reviewers, measuring it primarily by the standards of the genre it nominally inhabits, tended to find the slow first half frustrating and the violence, when it arrived, somewhat anticlimactic given the build-up. Critics who came to the film as cinema reviewers, measuring it by the standards of character theme and artistic intention, tended to find the same slow first half to be the film's most interesting achievement and to see the action sequences as necessary rather than central. This division is not a contradiction. It is a reflection of what the film actually is. A hybrid, a work that sits between two modes and asks its audience to travel willingly between them. The action film audience, conditioned by decades of films that treat the setup as merely instrumental as the delivery mechanism for the spectacle, found the film's ratio of contemplation to confrontation skewed in the wrong direction. A character drama audience, conditioned by films that treat action as a form of external narrative shorthand rather than as genuine dramatic expression, found in The Equalizer 3 something unexpectedly rich. Neither response is wrong. Both responses are partial. The truth of the film lives in the space between them. Audience response, measured through the various platforms and aggregate sites that now constitute the public record of how ordinary viewers receive films, was notably warmer than critical response, and the gap between the two is itself a meaningful data point. Audiences who had followed the franchise from the beginning responded to the film's elegiac quality with something close to gratitude. They recognized in it what Washington and Fuqua had clearly intended, a farewell that honored the character by giving him the ending his journey demanded. First-time viewers encountering McCall without the baggage of franchise loyalty tended to respond most powerfully to the Italian sequences and to Washington's performance, while sometimes sharing the critics' reservations about structural imbalance. The most interesting audience responses, and I spent considerable time reading them in the months after the film's release, came from viewers who described being unexpectedly moved by the film in ways they had not anticipated. The specific quality of that surprise, the way people describe being caught off guard by a feeling they did not expect an Equalizer film to produce, is itself a kind of testimony to what the film achieves at its best. Films that move you by surprise move you more deeply than films that set up the emotion in advance. The Equalizer 3, in its quietest passages, more than once achieves that quality of unexpected arrival. The awards conversation around the Equalizer 3 was, to be direct, minimal, and I want to say something about that because it reflects a persistent and somewhat troubling pattern in how the Academy and the awards ecosystem respond to certain kinds of films. Denzel Washington's performance in this film is, by any honest measure, among the finest work of his remarkable career. The specificity of it, the emotional precision of it, the way it holds together an entire franchise's worth of characterization and brings it to a quiet, earned conclusion. These are not qualities that a serious engagement with performance can overlook. And yet, the performance received no major awards recognition, no significant nominations from the bodies whose attention would have elevated conversation around the film. The reason for this is not complicated, even if it is frustrating. Trends that exist in the action genre, however artistically serious, however personally invested, however cinematically distinguished, are structurally disadvantaged in the awards ecosystem, which tends to reserve its highest recognition for films whose artistic ambition is immediately legible, for dramas that announce their seriousness through their form, for biopics that wear their importance on their sleeve, for films that ask to be taken seriously in the ways that awards bodies are accustomed to taking films seriously. Whether Equalizer 3 was asking to be taken seriously for the maturity of its central performance, the patience of its direction, the way it used genre as a vehicle for genuine human inquiry, is a kind of seriousness that the awards ecosystem does not yet have a reliable mechanism for recognizing, and that is not primarily a failure of this particular film. It is a structural failure of the conversation we have built around cinema, a conversation that too often equates genre with depth and literary form with artistic worth. The Equalizer 3 deserved at least the conversation. It did not receive it. That absence is worth naming. Now, from the world that received this film, let us move inward to the larger story of which it is a part. Because The Equalizer 3 does not exist in isolation. It is the third chapter of a trilogy, and understanding what it adds to and what it draws from the films that preceded it is essential to understanding what it is doing and why it makes the choices it makes. The first Equalizer film, released in 2014, is essentially an origin story in the classical sense, not of how McCall became what he is, since that history is only hinted at, but of how he becomes what he will be in relation to the world around him. the McCall of the first film is a man living in deliberate concealment, suppressing his capabilities, building a small life of routine and simple human connection in Boston. The film's central dramatic engine is the question of whether he will allow himself to be drawn back into the world of consequence, whether he will break his own peace on behalf of someone else's. The first film answers that question decisively and joyfully, in the way that classical action films answer it, with the release of a man's full capability, with the satisfaction of watching competence deployed in service of justice, with the visceral pleasure of a narrative in which the right person pays the right price. It is a beautifully made film, and it is a film that is entirely confident about the moral simplicity of its own universe. Robert McCall breaks his peace, and the world is better for it, and there is no significant ambiguity in that accounting. The second film, The Equalizer 2, released in 2018, is a more complicated and in some ways more interesting work than it is generally given credit for. It complicates the moral universe of the first film by asking what happens when the threat comes not from outside McCall's world, but from within it, from people who shared his formation, his training, his history. The second film's antagonists are not criminals operating in the underworld, but former operatives, people who made the same choices McCall made at an earlier stage of his life and then made different choices when those choices were no longer supervised by institutional loyalty. This complication, this sense that McCall is not simply a force of justice operating against a world of evil, but a man whose own history implicates him in the systems he now opposes, gives the second film a moral texture that the first film does not attempt. It also introduces what will become a central theme of the third film, the question of inheritance and transmission, of what McCall can pass on and to whom, of whether the skills and the instincts he carries are a gift or a contamination. The third film takes both of these thematic foundations and brings them to their logical and emotional conclusion. If the first film is the question, can McCall allow himself to engage? And the second film is the complication. What does it cost when engagement implicates the self? Then the third film is the answer. And the answer it gives is not triumphant in the conventional franchise sense. It is something quieter and more honest. The answer is that McCall can be both things, both the man capable of the violence and the man capable of the peace, and that these two things are not opposites to be reconciled, but dimensions of a single human truth to be accepted. The first film set McCall in motion. The second film interrogated his motion. The third film allows him to arrive somewhere. And that arc across three films, across nearly a decade, is one of the most coherent and emotionally complete character journeys that American action cinema has produced in a very long time. What the third film adds to the larger conversation that the first two began is, above all, the concept of home. The first two Equalizer films are fundamentally about displacement, about a man who does not belong to the ordinary world even as he moves through it in the guise of ordinariness. McCall in Boston, McCall in the streets of the city, McCall in the cab and the hardware store and the diner. He is always slightly apart, always slightly other, always performing a version of civilian life that he observes rather than inhabits. The third film replaces that displacement with something the earlier films deliberately withheld, a place where McCall might actually belong. Ardamonte is not just a beautiful setting, it is the franchise's first serious argument that Marco would have a home, and the film's emotional power at its deepest level derives from the tension between that possibility and the reality of what McCall is, between the warmth of belonging and the knowledge that what he carries will always make belonging complicated. What does this film add to what comes next? The honest answer given Washington and Fuqua's stated intention to close the franchise with this third film is that The Equalizer 3 adds a full stop where other franchises would add a comma. It does not set up a sequel. It does not leave loose narrative threads designed to pull you toward a future installment. It closes the door with the particular grace of a story that has decided to end, and in doing so, it gives the entire franchise a shape, a beginning, a middle, and a genuine conclusion that is increasingly rare in a film landscape organized almost entirely around perpetuation and expansion. The Equalizer 3 understood that the most honorable thing it could do for the story it was completing was to complete it honestly. And that decision, more than any single scene or image or performance, is what defines the film's place in the larger story of which it is a part. Let us now go even deeper, beneath the story, beneath the craft, beneath the franchise, to the place where films speak most quietly and most enduringly. Let us talk about what The Equalizer 3 is really saying, because every film that matters is saying something beyond its plot, beyond its characters, beyond the immediate surface of its narrative. And The Equalizer 3, more than either of its predecessors, is a film with something specific and genuine on its mind. At its emotional and intellectual core, this film is about the cost of capability. That is the idea it returns to again and again in different shagestas and through different images throughout its entire length. Not the cost of violence, which is a more familiar cinematic subject. Films about the psychological toll of combat, the trauma of soldiers, the weight of taking a life are numerous and well explored. The Equalizer 3 is interested in something slightly different, the cost of being extraordinarily good at something that you wish, at some level, that you were not extraordinarily good at. The cost of a capability that has defined your life so completely that you cannot separate yourself from it even in the moments when you most want to. Think about what that means in relation to Robert McCall as we understand him across this trilogy. He did not ask to be what he is. The formation that made him, the training, the intelligence swap, the years of operating in the shadow world was at some level something that happened to him as much as something he chose. And having been made into this instrument, having become this particular and devastating version of himself, he now lives with the permanent presence of a capability that will not simply switch off because he wants peace. The skills do not retire when he retires. The instincts do not cease when he orders them to cease. He will always walk into a room and calculate its vulnerabilities. He will always notice who is watching. He will always be the most dangerous person present. Even in a room full of friends, even at a dinner table, surrounded by warmth and wine and the uncomplicated happiness of ordinary life. The capability is not a tool he picks up and puts down, it is the structure of his perception, it is how he sees. And here is what this film understands about that condition, which is the insight that makes it more than a skill genre exercise. It understands that this is not unique to intelligence operatives or trained killers. It is a particular and extreme version of something that many human beings carry in less dramatic forms, the professional whose competence has become so deeply internal that they cannot stop working even when they are supposed to be resting, the caregiver whose vigilance does not switch off at the end of a shift, the parent whose protective instincts reorganize every environment they enter into a calculation of threat and safety. McCall is not a superhero parable. He is an extreme expression of what it means to be good at something in a way that the something begins to consume you, and what it costs to find beauty and peace and human connection on the other side of that consumption, when the consumption is never fully complete. The symbols and motifs to which the film carries this idea are, I think, more deliberately chosen than they appear on first viewing. Let us begin with the most obvious and work outward to the more subtle: water. The Tyrrhenian Sea is present in almost every exterior establishing short of Altamonte, and its presence is not merely geographical. Water in film has carried the weight of purification and return since the earliest mythological cinema, the idea of a body of water as a threshold, a space of transition between what one was and what one might become. McCall's recovery takes place beside the sea. His walks through the town always seem to orient themselves eventually toward the water. The scenes in which he is most visibly at peace tend to include the sea in the background, as if the water's presence is the condition of his stillness. And in the film's climactic sequences, the absence of a clear sea view in the frames, the way the action turns McCall inward into stone buildings, into narrow corridors away from the open horizon, is a visual argument that violence is a turning away from the water, from the peace it represents, toward the interior world of conflict. After the violence, when McCall returns to the open air of the town, the sea appears in the frame again. The water has not gone anywhere. It has been waiting for him. It is always waiting for him. That is the film's most persistent visual argument, that peace is not destroyed by violence, only interrupted, and that the man who earns his way back to the water each time will eventually arrive at the shore and stay. The meal, food in this film is sacred in the way it is sacred in the cultures being depicted, the communal meal as the fundamental human act, the table as the space where belonging is both enacted and communicated. McCall is invited to tables throughout the film, and the trajectory of those invitations, from cautious welcome to genuine inclusion, maps exactly the trajectory of his relationship to the town and to the idea of belonging it represents. The first meals he is invited to, he observes more than participates. He watches the food being prepared. He accepts what is offered with a careful, almost formal gratitude. As the film progresses, the quality of his presence at these tables changes. He begins to ask for things. He begins to offer things. He begins to laugh occasionally in a way that does not seem performed. The table is where McCall's recovery happens, not the medical recovery, which is its own process, but the human recovery, the slow, almost imperceptible relearning of what it means to be fed and to receive care and to simply be present with other people without tactical awareness organizing the experience. And when the violence threatens these meals, when the Camorra's shadow falls across these tables and these families, McCall's response is not strategic, it is personal. It is the response of a man protecting something that has become quietly and profoundly his own. The hands, pay attention if you return to this film, to how Fuqua frames McCall's hands throughout the narrative. In the action sequences, the hands are the instruments of the capability, fast, precise, final. But in the quiet sequences, the hands are something else entirely. There's a scene where McCall helps repair a portion of the town's stone wall, manual, physical work entirely unrelated to his history or his skills, and the camera finds his hands at work with the stone and the mortar, and something in the image is almost tender. These are the same hands that the film has shown us in the opening sequence, responsible for what they are responsible for. And here they are pressing stone into place in an old Italian wall, contributing to a structure that will outlast the moment, doing work that is simple and physical and entirely without consequence in any dramatic sense. The contrast is devastating in the best way. It says something about what McCall is seeking that no line of dialogue could say as precisely, not escape from what his hands can do, but the possibility of what else they might do. The possibility of construction in a life so heavily defined by its opposite, the church. Altamonte, like all old Italian towns, is organized around its church, both literally in the geography of the town square and symbolically in the way community life gravitates toward and away from that space. McCall is delivered to safety at the steps of a church in the film's opening act, which is not an accident. The image of this particular man, secular, operational, a career of considerable moral complexity, arriving at the threshold of a church and being received there, is one of the film's most layered visual arguments. The film does not make McCall religious. It does not offer religious redemption as his narrative destination, but it uses the church as a spatial symbol of the possibility of receiving, of being brought in without condition from whatever place you are arriving from. The town's relationship to the church is warm and practical rather than doctrinally intense. It is the community gathering place, the site of celebrations and ceremonies, the anchor of collective memory. McCall's relationship to it follows the same pattern. He does not seek it as a place of spiritual transaction. He inhabits its surroundings as part of inhabiting the town, and the fact that he was delivered to its depths, that his recovery began at that threshold, makes it, by the film's end, one of the charged spaces of his personal geography. That journey from the steps of the church as a site of near death to the steps of the church as a place of belonging is one of the film's quiet structural achievements. Now, moving outward from the symbols to the film's larger themes, and here I want to be careful because I promise simplicity rather than academic taxonomy, and this film's themes are best received as feelings rather than as categories. Let me try to say what this film is about in the most human terms I can find. This film is about the possibility of arriving. Not arriving in a destination, not arriving at a solution to the problem of oneself, but the possibility of arriving, of being present in a place and a moment fully enough that the past, however heavy, does not entirely determine the experience of now. McCall has a past that cannot be undone. The film makes no attempt to undo it. He has done what he has done, and the third film does not offer him the redemption narrative of a man who suffers enough to earn a clean slate. What it offers him instead is something more honest and more sustainable, a present that is genuinely different from the past, a life in this beautiful place with these specific people that is real and warm and his own, available to him now, however impermanent, however complicated by who he is and what he carries. That offer, the offer of the present tense, the possibility of now, is the film's most human and most valuable idea. And it resonates far beyond the story of Robert McCall specifically because it addresses something that a great many people carry in the modern world, the sense that the past, of personal failures, of damage done or damage received, of identities constructed in response to difficult conditions, has determined the future so thoroughly that arriving somewhere new and genuinely different is simply not available. The Equalizer tree, in its quietest and most sincere moments, argues against that sense. It argues that a man who has done what McCall has done can still sit at a dinner table in the Italian sun and receive warmth and give it back and mean it. It argues that arriving is possible even for people who have been traveling for a very long time through very difficult terrain. That is not a naive argument. The film earns it slowly over many quiet scenes through the accumulated weight of small moments, and because it is earned, it lands. The real world resonance of this film is, I think, connected to a broader cultural exhaustion that was visible in the years surrounding its release, a sense in many people of having been in perpetual crisis for so long that the idea of rest, of being somewhere safe and warm and genuinely at peace, had taken on an almost mythological quality. The COVID years and their aftermath, the constant turbulence of political and social upheaval, the grinding uncertainty of life in a world that seemed to be in a permanent state of emergency, all of this created in many people a longing for exactly what Altamonte represents in this film. A place where the pace is human, where community is real, where the pleasures of food and conversation and the company of other people are not hedged or deferred or secret, but milked. The Equalizer tree arrived into that longing and spoke to it directly, perhaps without fully intending to. But the best films always find the nerve of their cultural moment even when they are not explicitly trying. This film found something real. That is why it resonated as deeply as it did with certain audiences in ways they found difficult to fully articulate. Keep this in mind as well. The film's engagement with organized crime and with the Camorra specifically is not merely a genre convention, a villain delivery system for the plot. It is a genuine engagement with a real and enduring social reality. The Camorra, the organized crime network based in Naples and operating across southern Italy, is not a fictional invention. It is one of the oldest and most deeply entrenched criminal organizations in the world, with roots stretching back to at least the 17th century, and its grip on the economic and social life of communities throughout the south of Italy is a subject of ongoing political and journalistic concern in the actual world. The film's decision to situate its villain in this specific real-world criminal context rather than inventing a generic criminal organization give the social stakes of McCall's intervention a weight that pure fiction would not provide. These are not abstract bad people in a stylized criminal world. They are a recognizable version of a real phenomenon, the infiltration and exploitation of civil society by organized crime, and McCall's response to them carries, by association, the weight of every community that has ever been squeezed by that kind of institutional corruption and wished for someone to do something about it. What this film understands about that wish, and this is the part I keep returning to, is that the wish itself is morally complicated. We root for McCall in this film. We want him to protect these people and eliminate this threat. And yet, Fuqua and Washington are honest enough to make sure we feel the ambiguity underneath this satisfaction. The sense that a world in which Robert McCall is necessary is a world that has already failed in some fundamental way. The presence of a man like McCall is not the solution to the problem of the Camorra. It is a temporary and specific application of force in one small corner of a much larger and much more persistent phenomenon. The town is safer after McCall's intervention, but the system that produced the threat and would produce the next one is entirely untouched. This awareness, quiet, never moralized, present in the film's texture rather than its dialogue, keeps the Equalizer 3 from the kind of simple triumphalism that would make it feel dishonest. It allows you to feel the satisfaction of McCall's justice while simultaneously feeling the melancholy of understanding what that justice cannot fix. That combination, more than anything, is what separates serious genre cinema from simple entertainment. Now, from the themes this film carries, let us turn to the conversation it started, because films do not exist only in their viewing. They exist in what follows the viewing, in the discussions and debates and cultural reverberations that continue long after the credits have rolled and the lights have come back up. The Equalizer tree arrived into a specific cultural moment in cinema, a moment of considerable anxiety about the future of certain kinds of films and certain kinds of filmmaking. The mid-budget adult action drama, the kind of film made for grown-up audiences that does not rely on pre-existing intellectual property, that costs more than an independent film but less than a superhero blockbuster, that asks for patience and emotional investment rather than promising spectacle and sensation. This kind of film was in 2023 widely declared to be in crisis. The theatrical market, as studios and analysts were repeatedly insisting, had fragmented in such a way that only the very large and the very small could survive, and films like The Equalizer 3, the middle ground, the adult genre film, the star-driven character vehicle, were being squeezed out of existence by the economics of a marketplace reorganized around franchises and streamers. The Equalizer 3's theatrical performance was, in this context, something of a quiet act of resistance, not a massive box office triumph, but a genuine proof of concept that there remained a substantial audience for character-driven adult action if the film was made with the craft and the conviction to earn that audience's attention. This matters in the larger conversation about what cinema can and should be, because every film that demonstrates the viability of the mid-budget adult drama is an argument against the narrative of its extinction. Every time a film like this one finds its audience in theaters, on streaming platforms, in the slow accumulation of word-of-mouth recommendation, it is evidence that the appetite for cinema as an adult art form has not been consumed by the franchise machine, however powerful that machine may be. The film also arrived at a moment when the legacy of Denzel Washington himself was actively being reassessed in the critical conversation, a reassessment prompted partly by the approach of his career's later chapters and partly by a broader cultural reckoning with how American cinema values or fails to value the work of black actors in the upper tier of the industry. Washington's body of work, the breadth of it, the consistency of it, the way it has moved between commercial and prestige cinema with a freedom that few actors of any background have managed, was in 2023 receiving the kind of sustained retrospective attention that tends to precede canonical consolidation, and The Equalizer 3 participated in that reassessment by offering a late career performance of genuine distinction, one that invited comparisons not only to Washington's earlier work but to the broader tradition of late career performance in American cinema, to the way that certain actors find in their later work a depth and an ease and a willingness to be seen that earlier work, for all its brilliance, could not fully achieve. Washington in this film invites comparison to Clint Eastwood in his late directorial and performance work, to the willingness of a specific kind of masculine icon to look honestly at the cost of the persona that made them iconic, to allow the icon to be complicated by age and regret and the specific gravity of everything that has come before. This is not a comparison that diminishes either artist. It is a recognition that certain kinds of screen presences built on the image of controlled, purposeful capability carry within them, when they are inhabited by intelligent artists across a long career, the seeds of a particular and valuable kind of late career reckoning. Washington in The Equalizer 3 is doing what Eastwood did in Gran Torino and Unforgiven, using the icon's accumulated weight to ask what the icon has cost and whether what it has purchased was worth the price. That conversation, quietly started by this film, deserves to continue. The cultural conversation the film started in its Italian setting is also worth noting, because the choice to make a major American action film that is genuinely lovingly engaged with a specific European culture rather than using that culture as scenery resonated in ways that were not primarily critical but deeply personal for many viewers. Italians who saw the film responded with a mixture of pleasure and surprise. Pleasure at seeing their landscapes and their way of life depicted with care and warmth and genuine specificity, and surprise that a Hollywood franchise film had bothered to do so. The conversations that emerged in Italian cultural media around the film's release were, in their own way, a kind of cultural conversation about how American cinema sees the rest of the world, usually as backdrop, occasionally as the birth, and only rarely as a world with its own interior life worth taking seriously. The Equalizer 3, in taking Altamonte and its people seriously as subjects rather than settings, participated in a conversation about representation and cultural specificity that extended well beyond its genre. Does this film feel timeless or perfectly of its moment? I have been sitting with this question since I first asked myself it, and my honest answer is both, and that the bothness is the key to what makes it work. The things that feel timeless: Washington's performance, the visual beauty of the Italian landscapes, the fundamental human story of a wounded man finding warmth in an unexpected place, these will not age. 30 years from now, someone will find this film on whatever platform has replaced the platforms we use today, and they will watch Denzel Washington at a dinner table in southern Italy, and they will feel exactly what I felt watching it, because the thing being communicated is not culturally specific. It is simply human. But the things that feel perfectly of their moment, the longing for a certain kind of peace that the film's first half so beautifully embodies, the cultural exhaustion that made Aldemonte feel like a fantasy of exactly what the world needed, the specific anxiety about mid-budget cinema and the future of adult drama that gave the film's theatrical release an urgency beyond its own story. These will eventually become historical rather than immediate. 30 years from now, a viewer will need a footnote to fully understand why the idea of a film like this being made and released and finding its audience felt, in 2023, like a small act of hope. We do not need the footnote now. We are living inside the context it describes. And the fact that this film speaks so directly to that context while simultaneously reaching for something more permanent, something in the human experience that has nothing to do with streaming platforms or franchise economics or cultural exhaustion, is one of the most generous things it offers. This is the version of cinema that I come to the Cine Flux to celebrate, not the cinema that merely entertains. Though entertainment is not a small thing, but the cinema that reaches for something more, that uses the familiar machinery of genre to smuggle in a question, a feeling, an image that will stay with you longer than the plot, longer than the action, longer than the surface distraction brought you to the theater or the couch or the screen in the first place. The Equalizer 3, at its best moments, and it has many best moments, reaches for exactly that. It uses the Equalizer franchise's established machinery of skilled operator against organized crime to deliver something that the franchise's opening chapter could not have delivered alone, something that required the accumulation of three films and the earned weight of a long creative journey to become fully available, a meditation on what it means to arrive somewhere after a long time of being nowhere, and whether arriving is enough, and what you do with the piece if you are lucky enough to find it. And here is what I keep returning to, even now. In the quiet after all the analysis, this film is fundamentally optimistic. Not naively, not cheaply, but genuinely. The Equalizer 3 believes that a man like Robert McCall can find something worth protecting that is not a mission. It believes that the warmth of a community can penetrate even the most heavily armored version of a human self. It believes that the sea and the sun and a glass of wine and the sound of other people being alive can do something that all the years of operation and capability and moral purpose could not do alone. They can make a man feel that he is somewhere rather than merely on his way somewhere. That belief is quiet and it is hard won, and it is in the end what this film is for. From this moment we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. Still with me? Good. Then let us go all the way in, because the full experience of the Equalizer tree, what it is really doing, what it is actually saying underneath every image, and every quiet moment and every eruption of consequence, cannot be fully understood without looking at the specific architecture of how it resolves. The spoiler territory of this film is not primarily about plot twists or shocking reversals in the conventional sense. The Equalizer 3 does not traffic in the kind of narrative surprises that action thrillers sometimes use as a substitute for genuine dramatic development. Its revelations are emotional than informational. Its turning points are felt before they are understood. And that quality, the way these films' most significant moments arrive as feeling first and meaning second, is precisely what makes them worth examining in detail. Let us begin at the true beginning, the opening sequence, which I have spoken about in terms of its visual drama, but which deserves now to be fully unpacked for what it reveals about the film's larger intentions. The film opens in a vineyard, a sprawling, sun-drenched Sicilian wine estate, and what we find there is not the opening of a mission, but its aftermath. Bodies are arranged across the landscape with the particular stillness of the irreversible. McCall moves through the space alone, wounded, checking rooms and hallways with the methodical precision of a man completing a task he began some time earlier. We do not know what the task was. We do not know who these people were or what they did. We know only that McCall was here, and that the people who are also here are now no longer alive, and that something in the execution of whatever brought him here has cost him in a way that previous operations in the franchise have not. This withholding, the film's refusal to explain the opening sequence in the conventional expository sense, is a deliberate and sophisticated structural choice. In the first two Equalizer films, we are introduced to the threat before Mikhail engages it. We understand the context of the violence before it occurs. The third film inverts this entirely. We arrive after the violence without context, without explanation, and we are asked to sit inside the aftermath as McCall sits inside it, feeling the weight of what has happened without yet having the information to categorize it. This inversion is the film's first argument about what kind of story it intends to be. It is saying from its opening seconds that it is not interested in the mechanics of how McCall does what he does. It is interested in what the doing of it costs, and that cost is best communicated by beginning in the aftermath, where the mechanics are irrelevant and only the weight remains. What we learn gradually through the film's careful release of contextual information across its first act is that the vineyard sequence was the conclusion of a mission McCall undertook on behalf of former intelligence contacts, a mission involving the recovery of something or someone connected to a network of organized crime operating across southern Europe. The specific details of the mission matter less than its consequence. McCall was shot seriously and he was not supposed to survive the night. The fact that he did that he was found on the steps of that church in Altamonte, barely alive, by Marco and the doctor is the inciting accident of the entire story. The wound that nearly killed him is also, in the film's symbolic logic, the opening, the rupture in his armor through which the warmth of Altamonte eventually enters. This is worth sitting with because it is one of the film's most quietly profound structural ideas. McCall does not choose to come to Altamonte. He does not select it as a retreat or a destination or a place of intentional recovery. He arrives there by accident, by the specific accident of being too badly hurt to go anywhere else, of being reduced temporarily to the condition of a man who needs help rather than one who provides it. The wound is the precondition of the arrival, the near death is the precondition of the life, and this is not coincidental in the film's symbolic architecture. It is saying something specific about how certain kinds of profound change become available, not through decision or intention or the application of will, but through the rupture that strips away the layers of protection we have built and leaves us briefly open to something we would otherwise have deflected. McCall, at full operational capacity, would never have stopped in Altamonte. He would have passed through, recovered elsewhere, returned to the next mission. It took the wound to make him stay. It took nearly dying to teach him what living might feel like. The relationship between McCall and Marco develops across the film's first half in a way that carries most of the story's emotional weight, and I want to trace that development carefully because it is more intricately constructed than it initially appears. Marco is a young local police officer, earnest, decent, slightly in over his head with the realities of what the Camora's presence in his town actually means. He has the instincts of a good law enforcement officer and the institutional limitations of someone operating in a system that the Camorra has partially compromised. He wants to do the right thing. He does not always have the tools. When he first encounters McCall, the wounded stranger delivered to the church steps, his response is correct in it. In yours, the man receives care. He asks no questions that the situation does not require. He extends a basic human trust that McCall, in his history, has rarely been the recipient of. What develops between them is one of the film's genuine emotional achievements, and it operates on a level that the franchise's first two films never explored. Marco sees something in McCall that McCall has stopped being able to see in himself, a fundamental decency, a moral seriousness, an orientation toward justice that cuts through the complexity of McCall's history and identifies something essential. And McCall sees in Marco something equally important, the possibility of what he might have been in a different life or what he might pass forward in this one. The mentorship that develops between them is not programmatic. It is not the standard movie mentor dynamic in which the experienced operative trains the promising young recruit in the arts of combat. It is something quieter and more human. An older man recognizing in a younger one the same hunger for righteousness that drove his own earliest choices, and trying to give that hunger the wisdom it will need to survive contact with a world that does not always reward it. There is a pivotal conversation between Michael and Marco occurring at roughly the film's midpoint, in the kind of quiet outdoor setting that Fuqua repeatedly uses for the film's most emotionally significant dialogue, in which Michael says something to Marco that I think constitutes the moral center of the entire film. He tells Marco essentially that the most dangerous thing about being good at what Marco is good at is not the external threat it attracts. It is the internal one, the danger of becoming so invested in the mechanism of justice, in the capability, in the method, in the particular satisfaction of the right person paying the right price, that the mechanism becomes its own justification, that you stop asking whether what you are doing is right and start asking only whether you are doing it correctly. This is the self-knowledge that McCall has arrived at across three films and is now in this quiet conversation, transmitting to the person he trusts most in this world. He is trying to give Marco the wisdom that he himself acquired too late, the awareness that capability without conscience is indistinguishable from the thing you are fighting against. Marco listens, and what he does with that listening becomes, in the film's final act, one of the most emotionally satisfying resolutions in the franchise. But we are not there yet. let us talk about the point at which this film shifts completely. The moment I referenced in the earlier section without naming it fully. That moment occurs when the Comora's threat becomes personal in a specific and devastating way. For much of the film's first half, the Comora's presence in Altamonte has been a background reality, menacing but not yet directed at the people McCall specifically cares about. The film takes its time establishing the texture of this threat, the way it operates through implication and intimidation rather than open violence, the way it has corrupted certain local institutions while leaving others intact, the way it has normalized its own presence in the life of the town through years of accumulated accommodation. This is the kind of threat that is hardest to fight because it does not present itself as a fight, it presents itself as simply the way things are. The shift occurs when the camera's attention turns specifically toward the people McCall has come to love in this town, toward the family whose table he has shared, toward Marco himself, toward the doctor who saved his life. This turn is not arbitrary. It is triggered by McCall's own quiet interventions on behalf of the townspeople, small acts of protection that De Camora correctly identifies as the fingerprints of someone with more capability than an ordinary civilian. He has drawn attention, and that attention directed at the people around him is the specific cost of his presence in their world. His arrival in Altamonte, which gave him peace, has also brought danger to the very people whose warmth was the source of that peace. This is the film's central moral paradox, and it is handled with genuine complexity. McCall's presence in Altamonte is both the best thing that has happened to the town and a complicating danger to it. He is protection and he is threat. He is the safest person in the room and the reason the room became unsafe. The film does not resolve this paradox cheaply. It allows you to feel the weight of it, to feel that McCall's belonging in this place comes with a cost that is paid not only by him but by the people he belongs to. That cost is one of the reasons the eventual violence of the film's third act carries the particular emotional weight that it does. McCall is not fighting because it is right, though it is right. He is fighting because he is the reason the fight became necessary, and that knowledge gives his actions a moral urgency that pure righteousness alone could not produce. Now let us talk about Emma Collins and the CIA subplot, because in the film's full spoiler territory, the convergence of her investigation with Marco's situation in Altamonte reveals something more interesting than the surface mechanics of the thriller plot suggest. Emma Collins has been tracking a network of drug trafficking with deep connections to European organized crime, the Camorra among them, and her investigation has been complicated by the discovery that certain elements within her own intelligence community have been complicit in allowing parts of this network to operate, using the drug money to fund off-books intelligence operations that the official budget could not support. This is not a new story. In the world of spy thrillers, the corruption of intelligence institutions by the organizations they are supposed to be fighting is a familiar narrative in the genre. But what the film does with it, specifically in relation to McCall's story, is worth noting. Emma's investigation reveals that the mission that brought Marco to Sicily in the film's opening, the mission at the vineyard, was itself partially compromised by this institutional corruption. McCall was, without his knowledge, operating in a space where the lines between the sanctioned mission and the self-interested one had been deliberately blurred. He did what he was sent to do cleanly and completely. But the intelligence infrastructure that sent him was not operating with the purity of purpose he assumed. This revelation that even McCall, with all his capability and all his moral precision, can be used instrumentally by systems that do not share his integrity is one of the film's most quietly disturbing ideas. It extends the franchise's ongoing meditation on the relationship between individual moral agency and institutional corruption, and it makes McCall's choice to operate outside institutional frameworks in Altamonte, to help these people simply because they need help, with no mission briefing, no chain of command, no institutional sanction, feel not just personal but philosophically principled. Emma Collins arrives in Altamonte trailing the threads of her investigation, and her meeting with McCall, when it finally comes, is one of the film's most carefully written scenes. There is a quality to their dynamic that is different from the relationship McCall has with any other character in the film, With Marco, he is something like a mentor. With the townspeople, he is something like a neighbor, a friend, a member of a community. But with Emma Collins, he is something rarer and more complicated, a peer. Someone who operates from a shared formation, who understands the world he came from because she inhabits a version of it herself, and who is asking herself the same questions about institutional integrity, about the cost of capability, about what it means to serve systems that are imperfect when the service itself feels necessary, that McCall has been asking across three films. Their scenes together are not dramatic in the conventional thriller sense. They do not crackle with tension or compete for narrative dominance. They are, instead, unusually honest, two people who know enough of each other's word to dispense with the usual performances and to say something true. Those scenes are among the film's quiet pleasures, and they give Dakota Fanning enough space to do something with the character that the earlier sections of the film did not fully provide. Let us now go to the climax, the full confrontation that the film has been building toward across its entire length. Because the way this film chooses to stage its climactic violence is, I think, one of its most significant artistic decisions, and one that has not been fully appreciated in the critical conversation around the film. The climax of The Equalizer 3 takes place in Orthamonte itself, in the streets and buildings of the town that McCall has come to know intimately across the film's running time. This is, on one level, a practical narrative choice. The threat has come to his home, and so the response must occur in his home. But on a deeper level, the choice to stage the film's violence in the space of its beauty is the film's most direct visual argument about the relationship between the two. The same cobblestone streets where McCall took his morning walks, where he drank coffee and watched the town come to life, where the light fell in the specific, golden way that made him feel, for the first time in a long time, that he was somewhere rather than merely in transit. These streets are now the terrain of something else. And the contrast between what these spaces have meant across the film and what they now contain is not merely dramatic, it is heartbreaking in the specific way that the violation of a beloved place is always heartbreaking. You have been made to love this town. You have been given its warmth and its beauty and its human life in generous, unhurried detail. And now that warmth is the context for something cold, and the beauty is the backdrop for something brutal, and a human life is what is at stake. The film has earned your heartbreak by first earning your love. What McCall does in a climax is not, technically, different from what he has done in the previous two films. He moves through a space with little efficiency. He uses the environment as an instrument. He deploys his particular combination of tactical intelligence and physical capability to neutralize the threat in a way that is both complete and, in the specific moral accounting of these films, deserved. The people he confronts have made their choices. The consequences are McCall's specific form of justice. But the emotional experience of watching it is different, profoundly different, from watching the equivalent sequences in the first two films. And the difference is entirely a function of what the film has done in the 60 or 70 minutes that preceded this confrontation. Because you have spent those 60 or 70 minutes in the warmth of this place, with these people inside the possibility of McCall's peace, you have been given something to lose. And having something to lose changes everything about how violence feels. The action sequences in the first Equalizer are satisfying in the way that the application of precise justice against unambiguous evil is satisfying, cleanly, with the relief of a problem resolved. The action sequences in the climax of the Equalizer 3 carry a different emotional charge, the grief of necessity, the sorrow of a man who has glimpsed what he wanted and is now required, one more time, to be the thing that makes it possible rather than the thing that enjoys it. McCall moves through these streets not with the cold clarity of a man in his element, but with the particular determination of a man who understands the cost of what he is doing more fully than he has ever understood it before, and who is doing it anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. There is a specific moment in the climax that I want to describe because it contains, in a single image, the emotional truth of the entire trilogy. McCall is moving through a narrow street toward a final confrontation, and he passes a doorway that belongs to one of the families he has come to know across the film, a doorway he has entered many times as a guest, a neighbor, a person received into someone else's home. The door is closed now. The family is sheltered inside, as McCall has arranged. He pauses at the door, just for a moment, just for the length of a breath, and places his hand flat against the wood. He does not knock, he does not speak, he simply rests his hand against the door of a place where he has been welcome, and then he continues down the street toward what he has to do. That gesture, that single, silent, private gesture, is the emotional center of this film. It is a man saying goodbye to something even as he is fighting to preserve it. It is a man who understands that the act of protection and the act of belonging are not the same thing, and who has made his peace with being the former even when he longs to be the latter. It is Washington at his most economical and most devastating, communicating a complete inner life with a touch, in silence, in the space of a single second. I have watched that moment several times now, and it does not diminish. It is one of those rare instances of screen performance that achieves something language cannot achieve, a feeling so complete and so specific that the only honest response to it is silence. The resolution of the Camorra threat is, as in the previous films, complete. McCall does not leave the job half done. The specific men responsible for the threat to Artemonte and its people are dealt with in the particular consequential way that defines Michael's approach to justice. But the film's handling of the aftermath of this resolution is where its real distinction from its predecessors becomes most visible. In the first two Equalizer films, the violence is followed relatively quickly by a return to normalcy, Michael back in his space, the ordinary world reasserting itself, the suggestion that the mission, having been completed, has resolved the disruption and restored the equilibrium. The third film refuses discomfort. The aftermath in the Equalizer 3 is held at length. The film spends real time in the quiet that follows the violence, the literal process of a town recovering from what has happened within it, the specific human work of people returning to ordinary life after extraordinary destruction. And Mako's place in this aftermath is complicated in a way that the film handles with tremendous care. The town is grateful. The people he protected are alive and safe and warm toward him in the way that people are warm towards someone who has done something extraordinary on their behalf. But McCall himself is quieter than before. The violence has not resolved his inner life in the way that violence in action films conventionally resolves things. He has not earned his peace by fighting for it. He has purchased one more day of it at the price of being, one more time, the thing he is. What happens in the film's closing sequence is, I think, the most honest ending the franchise could have given itself, and it is an ending I find genuinely moving every time I sit with it. McCall is still in Altamonte. He is still at the table. He is still watching the sea. But there is a quality to his presence now that is slightly different from what it was before the violence. A quality that Washington communicates entirely through the body, through the specific way he holds himself in the film's final frames. He is at peace, but it is a peace that knows itself more fully now. It is a peace that has been tested and has held, and the holding of it has cost something, and the cost is visible in the way he sits and the way he looks at the water and the way he receives quietly the ordinary warmth of the life around him. Margot is there. Emma Collins, her investigation concluded, has moved on to whatever comes next in her own story. The doctor who first treated McCall stops to say good morning in the way of someone for whom this greeting has become routine, which is itself a form of miracle, when you consider that this man arrived at the steps of a church, barely alive, not so long ago. The ordinary life of the town flows around McCall, and he is in some genuine sense part of its flow now. Not entirely. Not without complication, not without the permanent presence of what he is and what he carries, but part of it, present in it, a reef. The film's final image is McCall at the water's edge, standing at the shore of the Tyrrhenian Sea with his back to the camera, looking out at the open water in the specific light of the late afternoon. It is a simple image. It does not announce itself. It does not editorialize or explain. It simply holds the man in the landscape and lets the landscape speak. The enormous, patient, indifferent beauty of the sea and the small human figure at its edge, and the light falling across both of them with equal generosity, as if the sea and the man are equally worthy of illumination. The image holds for longer than you expect. It does not cut to black in a rush, it breathes. It gives you time to be present in it. And what I feel in that final image is something that I find difficult to fully articulate, and that I also feel no particular need to fully articulate, because the film has earned the right to communicate beyond the reach of articulation. I feel something that is simultaneously the satisfaction of an arrival and the melancholy of understanding that arrivals are always temporary, always complicated, always shadowed by the knowledge of what it took to get here and what it will take to stay. I feel the specific beauty of a man who has been through everything this trilogy has put him through, and who is standing at the edge of the sea in the late afternoon light, and who is in this moment simply here, not on his way somewhere, not calculating the next move, not protecting or equalizing or intervening, just here at the water in the light, with the whole complicated weight of his life behind him, and the open sea in front of him, and the town, warm and alive, and his, somewhere just over his shoulder. That is Robert McCall at the end of his story. That is what 3 films and nearly a decade of creative investment have been building toward. Not a triumph, not a redemption in the cheap sense, an arrival. A man standing at the edge of something vast and beautiful, having chosen to be here, having earned the choosing. There are no post-credit scenes in the Equalizer 3, and I find that absence as eloquent as anything the film contains. There is no teaser for a sequel. There is no winking suggestion that the story continues, that McCall will be called back, that the franchise will find its way to a 4th chapter. The film ends and the credits roll, and that is the end of it. And the absence of anything after the credits is itself a statement, a refusal of the conventional franchise grammar that insists on perpetuation, that cannot allow a story to simply end. The Equalizer 3 ends completely, honestly, without reservation, and that ending, clean and final and earned, is one of the most generous things a franchise film has done for its audience in a very long time. The foreshadowing that the film plans in its earlier sections, and that only fully reveals itself on a second viewing, is, I think, worth cataloguing briefly, because there is a particular pleasure in retrospective clarity, in seeing how a film has been quietly telling you its ending from the beginning if only you knew how to read the signals. The wound in the opening sequence. I mentioned it earlier as the precondition of McCall's arrival, the rupture through which the warmth enters. On a second viewing, knowing where the film goes, the wound reads differently. It is not merely physical. The specific Quayfrum's wound, the camera finding it and dwelling on it in a way that seems almost tender, communicates something about the film's intentions that a first viewing cannot fully receive. This is the opening of a man, not merely the injury of one. This is the film showing you in its first minutes that what follows is a story about being opened, about the painful, necessary process of having your armor compromised so that something real can get through. McCall's habit of choosing a specific table at the cafe, always the same table, always with the same view of the square and the church and the street, is established early and returned to throughout the film. On a first viewing, this reads as characterization, the trained operative's instinct to maintain positional consistency, to always sit with the wall behind him and the exits in view. On a second viewing, knowing what this table comes to mean, the habit reads differently. This is a man choosing his place, not just tactically, emotionally. He keeps coming back to this table because this table is gradually becoming his place in the world. The specific coordinates of belonging, chosen so quietly and so consistently that he may not have consciously registered the choosing, but the film has, and we showed the recurring image of McCall watching children play in the town square, an image that appears 3 or 4 times across the film's first half, always, briefly, always without comment, is one of the film's most carefully planted emotional seeds. On first viewing, it registers as character atmosphere, a man of violence in the presence of innocence, the standard visual shorthand of the genre. On second viewing, understanding the film's full emotional argument, their image means something more specific. These are the people McCall is protecting in the most abstract and fundamental sense, not these specific children as individuals in danger, but childhood itself, the uncomplicated experience of being small and safe and fully present in the pleasure of play as a category of human experience worth protecting. McCall watching children play is McCall identifying without words what is at stake, what violence is the enemy of, what peace finally and essentially is for. And then there is the repeated motif of thresholds, doorways. Specifically, McCall crossing thresholds throughout the film carries a weight that accumulates across multiple viewings. The threshold of the church where he is delivered in near death, the threshold of the doctor's house where he recovers, the threshold of the cafe where he becomes a regular, the threshold of the family home where he first sits at a table that is not his and feels cautiously the possibility of belonging. And finally, in the climax, that threshold, the closed door of the family home, the hand pressed flat against the wood, the gesture that contains the entire emotional history of a man and a town and a trilogy. Thresholds in this film are the language of arrival. Each one crossed is a version of the same fundamental act, the act of entering, of choosing to be inside rather than outside, of accepting the risk and the gift of being in a place with people who know your name. And now I want to step away from all of it, the analysis, the symbols, the craft, the cultural conversation, the spoilers and their meanings. I want to step away from being a critic for a moment and simply be a person who watched this film and felt something, because that is, in the end, the only reason any of this matters. Films are not made for analysis, they're made for the experience of them. And the experience of the Killer Set 3 as I lived it is something I want to try to share honestly, not as a reviewer constructing an argument, but as a human being sitting in the quiet after something that moved them. Here is what I keep returning to. Not the action sequences, though they are accomplished. Not the Italian landscapes, though they are among the most beautiful things I have seen in a mainstream film in recent years. Not even Washington's full performance, extraordinary as it is across the film's entire length. What I keep returning to is a specific quality of feeling that the film produces in its quietest passages, a feeling I can only describe as the particular ache of watching someone learn to receive. To receive warmth, to receive care, to receive the ordinary, uncomplicated gift of being somewhere with people who are glad you are there. McCall learning to receive these things slowly, carefully, with a specific awkwardness of a man whose entire formation has been about giving, or more precisely about doing, about acting on the world, rather than simply being present in it, is what stays with me most deeply. Because it is, I think, one of the most human things cinema can show you. Not the extraordinary person doing extraordinary things, but the extraordinary person learning painstakingly to be ordinary, to sit still, to let the light land. The single moment that has not left me. And I have watched this film more than once now, and it has not left me across any of those viewings, is the one I described in the spoiler section. The hand on the door. McCall pausing on his way to the violence, placing his palm flat against the wood of a door behind which the people he loves are sheltered, and then continuing. I have thought about why that particular moment carries the weight it carries, and the closest I can come to an answer is this. It is a moment of pure private tenderness in the middle of a film about a man who has spent his entire life keeping tenderness at a professional distance. It is a gesture made for no one. There is no one watching. There is no audience for this gesture within the world of the film. There is no one to receive it. It is entirely internal, entirely self-directed, entirely the act of a man communicating something to himself about why he is doing what he is doing and what it means to him. And Washington makes it so quiet, so brief, so entirely without performance or demonstration, that it lands with the force of something real rather than something staged. That is the moment this film lives in. For me, that hand, that door, that breath, Did this film change how I see something? I have been asking myself this question since I first watched it, and the honest answer is yes, in a specific and modest way that I think is more valuable than the grand transformation that some films claim to produce. It did not change my understanding of violence or justice or the ethics of force, which are questions I had already formed views on, and which the film, for all its intelligence, does not substantially alter. What it changed or perhaps clarified is my understanding of what arrival actually means as a human experience. I had always thought of arrival primarily as an event, as the moment of reaching a destination, of completing a journey, of being somewhere you intended to be. The Equalizer 3 suggests something different. It suggests that arrival is a practice, not an event, that it requires not just presence in a place but a specific quality of attention to that presence, a willingness to actually be where you are, to let the warmth of the specific place and the specific people land rather than processing it through the filter of whatever you are carrying from before. McCall launched this slowly, imperfectly, across the film's running time. He never fully masters it, but the learning itself, the patient, costly, deeply human process of learning to be somewhere, is what the film is about, and it is a lesson I found I needed in a way I had not known before I sat down with it. Would I return to this film? I already have more than once, and I expect I will return to it again. Not for the plot, which I now know completely, but for exactly the quality of experience I have been trying to describe throughout this essay. The Italian light, the quiet of the first half, the dinner table scenes, the hand on the door, Washington's face at the end, turned toward the sea. These are things I want to revisit not because I want to understand them more thoroughly, but because I want to feel them again. That is the test of whether a film has become something more than entertainment, whether you are turned to it for the feeling rather than the information. By that test, the Equalizer 3 passes. Who will carry this film with them? I think it will be carried by people who have spent a long time being very good at something difficult and who have found or are still trying to find what they are when that something is not immediately required. By people who have moved through the world at the pace of purpose for so long that the idea of simply sitting somewhere and letting the afternoon pass has become a kind of luxury they are not sure they deserve. By people who have been hurt in ways that close them and who have found unexpectedly in some specific place or with some specific group of people the possibility of opening again. These people will recognize Robert McCall not as an action hero whose adventures they are following, but as a version of a feeling they know. The feeling of being somewhere warm after a very long time in the cold, and the specific vulnerability and the specific gratitude of that experience. Those people will carry this film. It was made for them, even if it did not know their names. Now let me bring all of this together as honestly and as simply as I can into a final accounting of what the Equalizer 3 is and what it is worth and who it is for. This is a film of genuine artistic ambition and genuine artistic achievement, and also of real and specific limitations that keep it from the tier of greatness it occasionally seems to be reaching toward. It is a film that uses the machinery of an action franchise to deliver something more personal and more emotionally complex than the franchise format typically allows. A meditation on the cost of capability, the possibility of peace, the meaning of belonging, the particular human experience of arriving somewhere after a very long journey. It achieves this meditation imperfectly, with an uneven second act and a CIA subplot that never fully delivers on the potential of its central character, and with action sequences that are technically accomplished but not quite as formally inventive as the film's quieter passages suggest they could have been. These are real limitations and they matter, but they do not undo what the film achieves at its best. And at its best, in the Italian sequences, in the development of the McCall and Marco relationship, in the film's visual drama of light and threshold and water, and above all in Washington's extraordinary career-defining performance, The Equalizer 3 achieves something that mainstream American cinema achieves rarely and that franchise cinema achieves almost never: genuine emotional truth, delivered apology in the context of a story that merely to be excited. Who will love this most deeply? The patient viewer, the one who does not arrive with the countdown to the first action beat running in their head. The one who is willing to spend an hour in the company of a wounded man discovering beauty and to find in that discovery enough to sustain their attention until the film's more dramatic second half arrives. The viewer who appreciates performance as an art form in its own right, who can find in a single expression or a single gesture more drama than an entire chase sequence provides. The viewer who wants to be moved rather than merely stimulated. Those viewers will find in this film something they will carry for a long time, who may not connect with it. The viewer who comes to the Equalizer franchise for the particular pleasure of efficient, propulsive action, who loved the first two films for their kinetic energy and their satisfying moral clarity, and who wants more of the same in a new location. That viewer will find in the film's extended first half a patience they did not come looking for, and the action sequences, when they arrive, may feel insufficient reward for the wait. There is no judgment in this observation. Different films speak to different needs, and this film's needs and certain viewers' needs are simply not a match. That is not a failure of either party. It is just the honest geometry of artistic ambition and audience expectation. Is this a film for the cinema, for streaming, or something to own? My honest recommendation is that it deserves to be seen on the largest screen available to you for a first viewing, not because it is a spectacle film that requires the skill of a cinema, but because the Italian photography, Richardson's cinematography, Fuqua's use of light and space, all of these are maximized on a large screen in a way that the smaller frame of a laptop or a phone genuinely diminishes. The film breathes differently on a large screen. The landscapes communicate differently. The silences land differently. After that first viewing, it is a film to own and to return to be available on a shelf or in a library for the kind of evening when you want to be reminded that somewhere in the world there is a small Italian coastal town where the light falls golden in the late afternoon and the people eat dinner together in the open air and time moves differently than it moves everywhere else. Some films are escapes. This one is a destination on destinations. My personal rating for The Equalizer 3 is 7.4 out of 10. And the sentence that reading is this: it is a film that gave me something I did not know I needed, delivered it imperfectly, and left it with me completely. 7.4 is not a small number in my accounting. It represents a film that succeeds more than it stumbles, that achieves something genuine more often than it settles for something functional, that leaves you with more than it asks from you. It is the rating of a film I am genuinely glad exists. Glad that Washington and Fuqua chose to close the story with beauty and patience and emotional honesty rather than with escalation and spectacle and the hollow satisfaction of a franchise obligation fulfilled. It is the rating of a film that earns its quiet, that earns its light, that earns its light, that earns finally and completely the hand on the door. And if you take nothing else from this entire essay, take this. Go find a table somewhere with a view of something beautiful. Sit down, order something warm, watch the light move for a little while. Let the afternoon pass without purpose. That is what this film is asking you to do. That is what Robert McCall spent 3 films learning how to do. It is harder than it sounds. It is worth everything it costs. Thank you. From the bottom of this channel and from the bottom of whatever it is in me that responds to cinema the way that I respond to it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to spend this time with the Equalizer 3 and with the Cine Flux, and with the idea that films deserve more than a summary and a score. If this essay gave you something, a new way of seeing a film you already loved, or the curiosity to find a film you had not yet discovered, or simply the particular pleasure of spending time with someone who cares deeply about the same things you care deeply about, then this channel has done what it came here to do. If you are watching this for the first time, the subscribe button is there, and it is genuine. Every subscriber is a person who decided that this kind of conversation about cinema is worth returning to, and that decision means something real to me. If this essay moved you or challenged you or opened something up, leave a comment. I read everything. I respond to as much as I can. This channel is the conversation, not a broadcast, and the comment section is where that conversation continues. And I have a few questions I want to leave you with, because the best films generate questions that stay open long after the credits roll, and the Equalizer tree has given me several that I cannot stop turning over. The first, do you think a man like Robert McCall, a man formed entirely by a word of consequence and capability, can ever fully belong to the ordinary warmth of a place like Altamonte? Or is belonging always going to be something he can approach but never quite touch? I want to know what you think. The second, the film makes a quiet but consistent argument that peace is something that must be earned and then protected, and that protecting it sometimes requires becoming the thing you are trying to move away from. Is that a contradiction the film resolves, or a contradiction it chooses to live inside? Where do you come down on that? And the third, the most personal, is there a place in your life that functions the way Ultimate functions for McCall? A place where time moves differently, where warmth is available without conditions, where you feel a particular relief of simply being somewhere rather than on your way somewhere? If there is, when did you last go back? Coming up next on the Cine Flux, we are going somewhere very different. A film that operates in almost perfect contrast to everything the Equalizer 3 is interested in. A film of cold precision and intellectual severity that asks what human beings are willing to sacrifice in service of an idea they believe in completely. It is a film I have been wanting to essay for a long time, and I think you are going to want to be there for it. Stay close. That is the Cine Flux. I will see you in the next one.